As you know, I'm not the kind of a person that reads books. I've said this before many times. I'm not fond of reading, but I have in the past made exceptions, and one of these exceptions was this part of the book that I'm sure you know, called Naked Lunch. Did I ever tell you about the man who taught his asshole to talk?
That was Frank Zappa, cult musician and provocateur, reading at the inaugural Nova Convention held in New York 1978. The book, Naked Lunch, was published in 1959 and met with outrage and bans across the globe for its allegedly obscene depictions of extreme hedonism. But by the late 1970s, having successfully shaken off multiple legal challenges, the novel and its author, William S. Burroughs, had emerged as heroes of an artistic revolution.
Here is Mr. William Burroughs.
Once you get acquainted with Burroughs, he's hard to shake off. One moment he's talking with the likes of Francis Bacon, the next rubbing elbows with Andy Warhol, and the next meeting Debbie Harry of Blondie and Bob Dylan backstage. Punk poet Patti Smith said he's up there with the Pope, you can't revere him enough. Evidently, the Beatles thought the same. Nowadays, we call this kind of cultural phenomenon going viral, spreading through culture like a contagion. This epidemiological model for culture and the spread of ideas is so prevalent that until viruses re-entered the public consciousness in the last few years, you'd be excused for not remembering the original biological association most concisely identified in Richard Dawkins' coining of the word meme as a derivation of gene. But unlike an image or a song you can't escape, the legacy of William Burroughs is viral not only because of its ubiquity in the culture.
I'm talking to you.
Given the controversial and often toxic nature of his work, you'd probably find it, like a virus, sickening. His writing focused on recurrent taboos like drug addiction, insanity, ultraviolence, death and sexuality, depicted in extreme, often gleeful detail, and the stories and ideas behind it are just as stomach-churning. Burroughs lived a life haunted by death, debauchery and despair. There's a bizarre, terrifying philosophy at work in his writing. A philosophy that lurks in the very DNA of the experimentation of the late 20th century. In a world where art is increasingly judged alongside the life of the artist, what do we make of his all-consuming influence? What does it say about him that he's garnered such an artistic following? And more importantly, what does it say about our culture that we've taken to him? By the time Naked Lunch, his third and most infamous book, was published in full by the Olympia Press in 1959, William Burroughs was already steeped in controversy. His first two novels, Junkie and Queer, had placed him outside the social and literary norms of modern America, detailing his experiences with drug addiction and his homosexuality, respectively, in semi-autobiographical narratives following his pseudonymous protagonist, Bill Lee. Because of its unflinching depiction of the use and abuse of drugs, Junkie had been heavily censored in its first edition, but its extremity pales in comparison to what came next. It's not really that helpful, or monetizable, to describe what Naked Lunch is about. A psychedelic blend of noir fiction, social satire, pornography, and body horror. It was initially released in snippets, known as routines, through small literary magazines, which Burroughs said could be read in any order. As such, attempting to summarise a plot doesn't really capture its bizarre, non-linear dream, or rather nightmare logic. At the very least, it features Burroughs' alter ego Bill Lee, who enters a strange land known as the Interzone, a dystopia filled with crime, corruption and conspiracy, which may well be the product of his drug-addled imagination. But the most significant thing about Naked Lunch is the effect, or effects, it produces. Straight away, disgust comes to mind. Tied up in claims of obscenity, disgust at a basic level serves to protect us from things which appear alien to us and may cause us harm. Bodily fluids repulse us because, through thousands of years of evolution, we've come to associate them with the spread of illness. Our disgust can keep us safe, and as one of our most powerful emotional responses, we tend to codify it in rationalised arguments. Looking at the horrified response of those seeking to censor Naked Lunch, we can see how moral judgments of the book were formed from such gut responses. Chief Justice Hudson in the Boston obscenity trial called it a revolting miasma of unrelieved perversion and disease, particularly owing to its depiction of so-called deviant forms of sexual activity, ranging from extreme sadism to simple homosexual affection. Disease in this case represents what he saw as the contamination of public discourse with ideas and subjects outside contemporary community standards. But disease also figures in the counter-arguments defending Naked Lunch. Burroughs himself claimed that his novel treats the health problem of drug addiction, which was in his view the true root of the sickness portrayed in the book, its presentation necessarily brutal, obscene and disgusting, while at the same time critiquing a culture that often diagnosed homosexuality as something to be cured through nightmarish medical scenes involving cured homosexuals. Giving in to disgust isn't always the best course of action. When what repulses us is already within us, it needs to be confronted and treated, not ignored and suppressed. It's from this idea that Naked Lunch gets its title, the frozen moment when everyone sees what's on the end of every fork. One of the reasons Naked Lunch was such a watershed moment in the culture is that it asked us to tackle and digest taboo but unavoidable subjects. When it was cleared of the obscenity charge, around the same time as Henry Miller's similarly explicit autobiographical novel Tropic of Cancer, it heralded the normalisation of such controversial themes as acceptable subjects for art, that America was developing a certain immunity to things previously seen as harmful and infectious. This effective endorsement of the crass and explicit as an acceptable feature of art certainly explains Burroughs' appeal to Frank Zappa, whose lyrics often sound like something straight out of Naked Lunch for all their gleefully transgressive detail.
Oh God, I am the American dream, but now I smell like Vaseline, and I'm a miserable son of a bitch. Am I a boy or a lady? I don't know which.
Yacht rock pioneers Donald Fagen and Walter Becker also found something to like in Naked Lunch, naming their band Steely Dan after a mechanical, steam-powered instrument from the novel. This might have been the biggest short-term effect of Burroughs' work, but there's more to it than just shock value. When Judge Hudson compared Naked Lunch to a miasma, literary sewage, he tapped into something Burroughs himself was trying to get across. It's a strange comparison, but like sewage, Naked Lunch is something of a waste product. In one sense, it represented the digested, fermenting thoughts and experiences of social underworlds that Burroughs had traversed from New York to Vienna to Tangier. A collection of notes on drug use which
spill off the page in all directions. Kaleidoscope of vistas, medley of tunes and street noises, farts and riot yips.
The dulcet tones of William Burroughs there. But in a more literal sense, it was constructed from literary waste. The rearrangeable routines that constitute the book were taken from a vast word hoard written between 1954 and 1958, more than 1,000 pages of typewritten content, from which Burroughs' friends and fellow writers Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac helped to build the text. It was never conceived of as a homogeneous novel. As a result, beyond just how uncomfortable the ideas and descriptions contained in the book are, its very construction as a non-linear series of incoherent episodes challenges the reader in the same way as a code or scrambled transmission. And this is kind of the point. Every writer has their philosophy, an implicit or explicit set of ideas and values that colour anything they write and inform thematic and aesthetic decisions. But with Burroughs, the lines between playful experimentation and sincere commentary are uncomfortably blurred. To try and fully explain just what it was Burroughs believed is far beyond the scope of a 20-minute video essay, and even then, it's hard to tell just where he stands. But it broadly boils down to this. While the majority of literature can be said to explore moral conflict, Burroughs rejected what he viewed as a dualistic perspective on the world, discarding the binary of good and evil in favour of a general antagonism towards control. Control could mean any number of things for Burroughs: religion, government, codes of ethics, rules, regulations, censorship. All things parodied in Naked Lunch. But most peculiarly of all, Burroughs believed that the ultimate form of control was language itself, and frequently compared it to a virus. The virus as an image appears frequently in Naked Lunch, before spreading across his other novels, and notably in his non-fiction writing. In his formulation, viral language, and indeed any form of communication, is designed to replicate itself, from speaker to listener and so on, with language users becoming hosts to its codes, its DNA, like animal cells exposed to pathogens. Because everyone uses the same common words to refer to themselves, language makes us, Burroughs argues, functionally the same, mutating us into creatures exhibiting the same symptoms, and this is what makes it one of the most powerful instruments of control, supplanting our individuality with one fit-for-all pattern. It's difficult to know just how far Burroughs actually took this theory. In some places, it seems like more than a metaphor to him, with one essay theorising that language resulted from a mutation caused by a virus in apes, an idea he attributes to a fictional doctor, Kurt Unruh. We'll get a little more into his strange ideas later, but this idea of language as a kind of genetic aberration takes us back to that strange but iconic moment from Naked Lunch, the talking arsehole monologue. A man develops speech in a part of himself that shouldn't talk.
After a while, the ass started talking on its own.
Eventually leading to the violent disintegration of his whole body.
Then the asshole said to him, "It's you who will shut up in the end, not me, because we don't need you around here anymore." So finally his mouth sealed over. For a while, you could see the silent, helpless suffering of the brain behind the eyes. Then finally the brain must have died, because the eyes went out.
It's funny, sure, and it does work well as a stand-up comedy routine, but it's also undeniably horrific, a vivid moment of body horror, rooted in the acquisition of language. To combat what he saw as this tyrannical capability of language, which largely operates in the linear syntax of sentences formed by the grammar virus, Burroughs sought to scramble its messages of control. Hence, in Naked Lunch, the randomly ordered routines, with the reader's confusion at the non-linear narrative acting as a circuit break from the barrage of conventional media. Burroughs' book is simply a way of fighting fire with fire, a how-to book, as he calls it, for an up-and-coming counterculture, resisting the mainstream's attempts to control it. But this was just the beginning of his program of detox, a first step into a radical new aesthetic that would take the 20th century by storm. In 1958, Burroughs' friend, the artist Brian Gisson, was in the process of making a table mat out of newspaper for his studio. Having cut the sheets into segments, he noticed that from the fragments of text he had created, by changing their order, he could also change their meaning. This innovative form of collage, known as the cut-up method, had first been used by artists of the Dada movement in the 1920s, before quickly falling out of fashion. But in the arsenal of Gisson and Burroughs, it found new, energised life across various media. But notably, it became Burroughs' modus operandi for a significant period in his career. For Burroughs, it was the perfect way of disrupting the coherence of control transmissions. But cut-up was also seen as a conduit to some great unconscious power that could dictate the shape and meaning of a work, even tell the future, lessening the creator's own control over his creation in favour of bowing to a grand, metaphysical energy known as chance. Burroughs' subsequent Nova trilogy was written almost entirely using cut-ups, books that make Naked Lunch seem coherent and lucid by comparison. But while it makes for an even more impenetrable narrative experience, its possibilities for art in general were quickly exploited. Around the time that Burroughs was working on finishing the trilogy, he was invited to give a reading at the Indica bookshop in London, and soon got talking with its patron, Paul McCartney. Macca was in the process of recording the Beatles' 7th album, Revolver, and invited Burroughs to sit in on some of the studio work, discussing the power of using tape machines to cut and splice pre-recorded sounds, which feature heavily on several tracks. The sound collage on the album's closing track, Tomorrow Never Knows, has a distinctly Burroughs-esque quality, with its title evoking something of the cut-up's mystical powers. When you cut into the present, the future leaks out. Perhaps more famously, David Bowie explicitly employed literary cut-ups in his lyrics, following an interview with Burroughs for Rolling Stone in 1973.
This is the way I do cut-ups. I don't know if it's like the way Brian Gisson does his or Burroughs does his, I don't know. But this is the way I do.
Bowie had previously drawn from Burroughs in creating The Spiders from Mars, modelled on characters from Burroughs' novel The Wild Boys, but adopted his experimental method on the album Diamond Dogs. There's something particularly viral about cut-ups, and not just because of how their influence has spread. Viruses, unlike bacteria, can't really be thought of as living organisms. Bacteria can survive on their own, replicating through simple cell division, But viruses depend on other cells to reproduce and spread. They contain the potential for life, but only in the form of isolated strands of DNA ready to be grafted onto a host, like bits of cut-up material, reordered and inserted into other works. What better analogy for Burroughs' form of writing, really? But there's also something pretty disingenuous, even sinister, about this comparison. You see, Burroughs' theory of literature tends towards an assumption that works are independent of their creators. When a pandemic rips through a population, where it came from is usually of less concern than what illness it causes and how it can be treated. As the last 15 minutes have demonstrated, there is plenty to talk about in the effects and transmission of Burroughs' viral works when we put them under a microscope. But in this neat, extended metaphor, the man himself, as patient zero, is unsettlingly absent.
Mr. Burroughs, do you regret anything in your life?
I am very lucky if I get through a day without something I did wrong, something I said wrong, gestured wrong. You talk about a lifetime? Good God. Practically everything.
This has been a difficult video to write, because as impenetrable as his stuff can be, Burroughs is a visionary and undeniably unique writer with a cultural impact so far-reaching it's almost hard to encapsulate. But he was also a deeply troubled and troubling person. The whole separating the art from the artist debate is a divisive one, but when it comes to Burroughs, because of how much of his own life he includes in his writing, it's pretty much impossible to keep the two apart. Founding member of the Beat movement, along with the poet Allen Ginsberg and novelist Jack Kerouac, Burroughs' immersion in 50s counterculture also involved a fair few brushes with the law. He had become heavily addicted to morphine and then heroin while living in New York on a generous allowance from his parents, having been rejected from service in the Navy. To get his fix, Burroughs took to dealing, and even forged prescriptions, leading to his second arrest. The first being for his implication in the murder of David Camera at the hands of his mutual friend Lucien Carr, whom both he and Kerouac assisted in the hours after the killing. But the crucial moment in Burroughs' life, the black hole that consumes almost everything he does afterwards, came in 1951. On the 6th of December, Burroughs and his partner Joan Vollmer were at a party hosted at a friend's apartment in Mexico City. The couple had fled there following a string of drug-related charges, and with limited access to heroin, Burroughs turned to drink, having multiple gay relationships while they contemplated divorce. That evening, Burroughs shot Vollmer in the head. Their 4-year-old son was present. Though he offered multiple stories as to how the killing occurred, the most famous and most reliable story, corroborated by multiple witnesses, was that the couple had been drunkenly attempting to recreate the William Tell stunt, with Vollmer balancing a glass on her head. Burroughs missed. Burroughs then fled back to the States and received a conviction for manslaughter and a 2-year suspended sentence. The exact nature of just what happened is contested, but it's the way Burroughs processes this event that leaves a nasty taste in the mouth. In the preface to Queer, written just under 2 years later, Burroughs writes that he has come to the appalling conclusion that I would never have become a writer but for Joan's death. It's an admission of guilt that also frames his frenzy of writing, the creation of the word horde that spawned Naked Lunch and much after it, as a kind of penitent act, or, conversely, a release of creative energy. Though the guilt over this act would be understandably unbearable, particularly at the idea that he had subconsciously wanted to kill her, as he often theorised, Burroughs didn't hesitate to weave the event into his pseudo-scientific philosophy, suggesting that the brain drew the bullet toward it, or that he had been possessed, infected by an ugly spirit, monopolistic, acquisitive evil. He then went on to question the certainty of conscious intent. If everyone is to be made responsible for everything they do, you must extend responsibility beyond the level of conscious intention. His use of cut-ups similarly wishes to do away with the idea of conscious intention through the element of randomness involved. But these words come from somewhere. Words may be inherited, transmitted and passed on like germs, their effects to an extent determined by the hosts at the receiving end. But ideas and utterances are produced with a purpose. Burroughs' disdain for control gives him a vehicle to escape personal responsibility, while elsewhere he argued for strangely authoritarian ideals. He paradoxically espoused the benefits of a segregated society, applying his pseudo-biological lens to refer to women as a basic mistake of evolution, with the family being a ridiculous unit devised in order to control the individual. A convenient concept for a man who spent his limited time as a parent exposing his young son, Billy Burroughs Jr., to drugs that he would become addicted to, and alleged molestation. Everyone is entitled to their own experience, but when I read Burroughs, in light of all of this, I can't help but feel implicated in, or infected by the nihilistic worldview he propagated. His influence may be contagious, but what about his guilt, the thing that spawned his writing in the first place? For all his outrageous transgression and obscenity, Burroughs was an expert in hiding in plain sight. His style, ripped from Hollywood detective films, made him seem more like a figure from a bygone age, too quaint, too scholarly to be harmful. But he understood the power of aesthetic choices to hypnotise people. All the way back in high school, he'd written an essay on personal magnetism. Ultimately, he was able to ensnare and infect a generation with his art. And that's the thing about him. As much as I'm morally repulsed by him, disturbed by his imagery and ideas, there's something compelling about his confidence and the boldness of his writing. That's his trick, transforming moral stances into simple aesthetic features. The most unsettling example is his late career foray into shotgun art, where cans of paint would be fired at to create random patterns on canvases, literally making art with the tool that authored his wife's death. It's arguable that our cultural acceptance of his art, because of the nature of it, is also to an extent an acceptance of his morality. Given all this, should we risk reading Burroughs? Call it a cop-out, but I don't think there's a straightforward answer. People read and write for many different reasons. In all walks of history, flawed people in some way have been behind progress, whether it be in art or science or politics. Because of how crucial they can be to historical narratives, simply discarding them, getting them out of the picture, is a hard ask. In modern culture, Burroughs is everywhere, pandemic even. It's just not practical to do away with everything he touches. But in my view, it's important to remember where these things come from, and approach them with a critical eye. If we simply ignore the disquieting parts of culture, we miss out on an awful lot, and come away with a false impression of the present. So, should we risk infection? Well, depending on how you view it, we're infected already. Culture, on the one hand, distinguishes us from other forms of life, allowing us to transcend barbarity. But a culture is also an environment where pathogens flourish. Maybe the toxicity of many of Burroughs' ideas serves to inoculate us all. It's an argument John Milton made all the way back in 1644 in a plea for the freedom of the press, a defence of so-called bad books. Bad books, which Milton refers to as capable of infection, to a discreet and judicious reader serve in many respects to discover, to confute, to forewarn, and to illustrate. Maybe this too can be said of Naked Lunch. But that's assuming you can get past the toxicity of its surface, which, as Burroughs says himself, is not for weak stomachs.